Deep in the shadow-draped hollows of Appalachia, where morning mist clings to ancient ridgelines like ghostly fingers, something far more sinister than mountain legends once thrived. While most people think of these mountains as home to simple folk living off the land, the truth is that isolation breeds extremes, and in the most remote valleys, where federal law was nothing more than a distant rumor, religious fervor twisted into something unrecognizable. Today, we're descending into the darkest chapters of Appalachian history, exploring cults so dangerous and bizarre that their very existence was systematically erased from official records. These weren't your typical religious communities seeking spiritual enlightenment. These were organizations that used faith as a weapon, turning sacred beliefs into tools of control, manipulation, and unspeakable violence. Before we venture into these forgotten hollows, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next on this channel, especially if you're fascinated by the hidden darkness that can flourish when civilization looks the other way. What you're about to discover isn't found in any history textbook. These stories were deliberately buried, their records destroyed, their witnesses silenced. But the mountains remember everything, and sometimes, if you know where to look, you can still find traces of what once was. 1. The Serpent's Covenant of Widows Creek. Nestled in a narrow valley where the Tennessee-Kentucky border becomes meaningless, the community known as the Serpent's Covenant emerged in 1923 under the leadership of a charismatic preacher named Ezekiel Thornfield. Unlike traditional snake-handling churches that use serpents as symbols of faith, Thornfield's followers believed that venomous snakes were direct messengers from God, capable of revealing divine truths through their bites. The Covenant's doctrine centered around what they called the poison prophecy. Members believed that surviving multiple snake bites would grant them supernatural abilities and direct communication with the divine. New initiates were required to endure what they termed the trial of scales, where they would be bitten by increasingly venomous species until they either died or achieved what Thornfield called enlightenment. Local authorities first became aware of the covenant in 1925 when a traveling merchant discovered what appeared to be a mass burial site near Widows Creek. The shallow graves contained the remains of at least 30 individuals, all showing signs of multiple snake bites. More disturbing was the discovery of makeshift medical equipment and detailed journals documenting each victim's reactions to different venoms. The Covenant's compound consisted of several wooden structures built around a central pit that served as their serpent sanctuary. Survivors who later escaped described this pit as containing hundreds of snakes from across the region, including timber rattlers, copperheads, and cottonmouths. The most prized specimens were exotic venomous species that Thornfield somehow acquired through mysterious connections. Members lived in a state of constant preparation for their next trial. Children as young as 8 were exposed to non-venomous snakes to build their tolerance and faith. Adults underwent regular bite sessions, with the most devoted followers displaying arms and legs covered in scars from countless encounters. Those who survived multiple trials were elevated to positions of authority within the group's hierarchy. The Covenant's end came suddenly in the winter of 1928. Federal agents, investigating reports of illegal snake trafficking, discovered the compound completely abandoned. Buildings stood empty, personal belongings scattered as if residents had fled in extraordinary haste. Most disturbing was the serpent pit, which was found to contain not just snakes, but human remains in various stages of decomposition, suggesting the final ceremony had gone catastrophically wrong. Local records indicate that 17 members of the Covenant were never accounted for after the abandonment. Some historians believe they perished in a final ritual gone wrong, while others suggest they dispersed into the mountains, carrying their dangerous beliefs to other isolated communities. Even today, hikers in the Widow's Creek area report finding unusual snake populations and strange symbols carved into trees. 2. The Blood Moon Disciples of Kettle Ridge. In the remote highlands of West Virginia, where civilization dwindles to nothing more than forgotten mining roads, the Blood Moon Disciples established their kingdom of terror in 1934. Led by a former Methodist minister turned prophet named Jeremiah Blackwood, this cult combined Christian imagery with ancient blood rituals that would have made medieval inquisitors recoil in horror. Blackwood preached that the world would end during a series of blood moons, and only those who had purified themselves through sacred bloodletting would ascend to paradise. His followers, numbering nearly 200 at the cult's peak, lived in a fortified compound where they practiced increasingly extreme forms of ritual sacrifice and self-mutilation. The disciples believed that human blood contained different spiritual properties depending on the donor's age, gender, and level of faith. Children's blood was considered the most powerful, followed by pregnant women, then elderly members who had proven their devotion. The cult maintained detailed records of blood collection, documenting the spiritual value of each donation and the supposed visions that resulted from consuming it. New members underwent an initiation process called the Crimson Baptism, where they were required to drink a mixture of blood from multiple donors while reciting Blackwood's twisted interpretation of biblical verses. Those who refused or became ill during the ceremony were considered unworthy and faced exile into the wilderness, usually during winter months when survival was impossible. The compound itself was a maze of underground tunnels and chambers carved into the mountainside. The central worship area featured an altar made from stacked human skulls where daily blood rituals took place. Surrounding chambers served as sleeping quarters, storage areas for preserved blood, and holding cells for those deemed spiritually impure. Blackwood's control over his followers was absolute. He claimed to receive direct revelations from God through blood visions, and his prophecies determined every aspect of daily life. Members were forbidden from leaving the compound without permission, communicating with outsiders, or questioning any aspect of the doctrine. Those who violated these rules faced increasingly severe punishments, culminating in what disciples called the final offering. The cult's activities first attracted outside attention in 1937, when a young woman who had escaped the compound reached a nearby town and reported the horrors she had witnessed. Her testimony described ritual murders disguised as religious ceremonies, with victims chosen through a lottery system that Blackwood claimed was divinely guided. Federal investigators who finally raided the compound in 1938 found evidence of systematic torture, murder, and cannibalism. The underground chambers contained the remains of at least 60 individuals, many showing signs of ritualistic mutilation. Most shocking was the discovery of Blackwood's private chambers, which contained hundreds of glass vials filled with blood, each labeled with the donor's name and spiritual significance. The raid itself became the stuff of legend among law enforcement. Disciples who remained loyal to Blackwood fought desperately to protect their prophet, using makeshift weapons and their intimate knowledge of the tunnel system. The final confrontation occurred in the main worship chamber, where Blackwood was found attempting to complete what he called the ultimate sacrifice, surrounded by the bodies of his most devoted followers. 3. The Hollow Earth Communion of Devil's Backbone. Perhaps the most bizarre cult to emerge from Appalachian isolation was the Hollow Earth Communion, which established itself along Devil's Backbone Ridge in eastern Kentucky during the late 1940s. Founded by a former geology professor named Dr. Marcus Vane, this group combined pseudo-scientific theories with religious extremism to create a belief system that defied all logic and morality. Vane preached that the earth was hollow and inhabited by advanced beings who communicated through underground cave systems. He claimed to have discovered an entrance to this subterranean world during his geological surveys and received divine knowledge from the beings within. His followers, mostly educated individuals disillusioned by post-war society, believed they could achieve immortality by joining these underground inhabitants. The communion's compound was built directly over a network of natural caves that Vane claimed were portals to the hollow earth. Members spent most of their time underground, living in chambers carved from limestone and participating in rituals designed to attract the attention of the subterranean beings. These ceremonies involved complex geometric patterns, strange musical instruments, and the sacrifice of surface dwellers who were deemed spiritually inferior. Vane taught that traditional surface religion was a corruption designed to keep humanity ignorant of the true spiritual realm below. His doctrine required members to abandon all connections to the outside world, including family, friends, and previous identities. They were given new names based on mathematical formulas that Vane claimed would resonate with the Hollow Earth inhabitants. The cult's recruitment methods were particularly insidious. Vane used his academic credentials and scientific language to attract intellectuals and professionals who might otherwise be skeptical of religious extremism. He presented his theories as groundbreaking discoveries rather than faith-based beliefs, using geological charts and underground surveys to support his claims. Members of the communion underwent a gradual transformation process that began with extended stays in the cave system. They were told that prolonged exposure to the underground environment would prepare their bodies for eventual transportation to the hollow earth. In reality, the constant darkness and isolation created a state of psychological dependency that made escape increasingly difficult. The communion's activities came to light in 1952 when a former member who had managed to escape contacted federal authorities. His testimony described a community living entirely underground, subsisting on mushrooms and other cave-dwelling organisms, and participating in rituals that involved human sacrifice to appease the supposed hollow earth beings. The investigation that followed revealed the true horror of Vane's operation. The cave system had been extensively modified to create living spaces, worship areas, and what could only be described as laboratories where members conducted experiments on captured outsiders. These experiments, supposedly designed to study the effects of underground living on human physiology, were actually forms of torture disguised as scientific research. When federal agents finally entered the cave system, they found evidence of at least 40 murders, along with detailed records of the experiments conducted on victims. Most disturbing was the discovery of Vane's private laboratory, where he had been attempting to create what he called hybrid beings, supposedly combining human DNA with genetic material from cave-dwelling creatures. The communion's end came when authorities discovered that Vane had been systematically poisoning his followers with compounds extracted from toxic cave fungi. His journals revealed that he had never believed in the hollow earth theory himself, instead using it as a cover for psychological experiments on human subjects. The final entry in his journal simply read, "The greatest discovery is not what lies beneath the earth, but what lies beneath human nature when all constraints are removed." These three cults represent just the beginning of our journey into Appalachian darkness. Each group exploited the isolation of mountain life to create their own twisted kingdoms where normal moral boundaries simply cease to exist. But what we've explored so far pales in comparison to what's coming next. The mountains have always been a refuge for those seeking to escape society's watchful eye, but some who ventured into these remote hollows brought with them ideas so twisted that even the ancient peaks seem to recoil. As we descend deeper into this forgotten history, the stories become increasingly disturbing, the evidence more scattered, and the truth more difficult to separate from nightmare. 4. The Purification Assembly of Blackwater Falls. In the mist-shrouded valleys surrounding Blackwater Falls, West Virginia, a cult emerged in 1941 that would redefine the very concept of religious extremism. The Purification Assembly, led by a former Army chaplain named Colonel Isaiah Mordecai, believed that humanity had become so corrupted by modern civilization that only through extreme physical and spiritual cleansing could souls achieve salvation. Mordecai's doctrine centered on what he called the Great Cleansing, a process that involved subjecting members to increasingly severe forms of purification designed to strip away their connection to the corrupt outside world. These rituals began with extended fasting periods that could last up to 3 weeks, during which members were allowed only water and what Mordecai termed sacred herbs, which investigators later identified as a mixture of toxic mountain plants that induced hallucinations and physical weakness. The assembly's compound was constructed like a medieval monastery, with high stone walls and guard towers manned by Mordecai's most trusted disciples. Inside, the living conditions were deliberately harsh. Members slept on bare stone floors in unheated cells, wore rough burlap clothing regardless of weather, and were forbidden from speaking except during designated prayer periods. Any comfort or pleasure was considered evidence of spiritual weakness that required immediate correction. New recruits underwent an initiation process called the stripping of self, which began with the complete destruction of all personal possessions, including photographs, letters, and clothing from their previous lives. They were then subjected to a series of increasingly brutal purification rituals designed to break down their individual identity and remake them as vessels for divine will. The most disturbing aspect of the assembly's practices was their treatment of children. Mordecai taught that children born into the modern world were inherently tainted and required more extreme purification than adults. Young members were subjected to isolation in underground chambers for weeks at a time, emerging pale and psychologically shattered. Many never fully recovered from these experiences, displaying symptoms that modern psychologists would recognize as severe trauma disorders. The assembly's hierarchy was rigidly enforced through a system of punishments that escalated from public humiliation to physical torture. Members who questioned Mordecai's teachings or showed signs of doubt were subjected to purification rituals that often proved fatal. The colonel maintained detailed records of these sessions, describing them as necessary spiritual surgery to remove the cancer of independent thought. Local authorities first became suspicious of the assembly in 1944 when several families in nearby towns reported that relatives who had joined the group had stopped all communication. Initial investigations were hampered by the compound's remote location and the reluctance of surviving members to speak with outsiders. Those who did manage to escape often displayed signs of severe psychological trauma and were unable to provide coherent testimony about their experiences. The truth about the Purification Assembly finally came to light in 1946, when a fire at the compound killed 17 members and forced survivors to seek help from local communities. Hospital workers treating the survivors discovered evidence of systematic torture, malnutrition, and psychological abuse that shocked even experienced medical professionals. Many survivors bore scars from ritualistic cutting and branding, while others showed signs of prolonged exposure to toxic substances. Federal investigators who examined the compound after the fire found evidence of mass graves containing the remains of at least 50 individuals, many showing signs of death by starvation, poisoning, or violence. Mordecai's private quarters contained thousands of pages of journals documenting his experiments in human purification, along with detailed plans for expanding the assembly's influence throughout the Appalachian region. The colonel himself was never found. Some investigators believe he perished in the fire, while others suggest he escaped into the wilderness with a small group of devoted followers. Local legends claim that strange lights can still be seen near Blackwater Falls on certain nights, and hikers occasionally report finding stone altars and ritual circles that match descriptions from assembly survivors. 5. The Eternal Harvest Ministry of Copper Ridge. Deep in the coal-scarred mountains of eastern Kentucky, where strip mining had left the landscape resembling an alien world, the Eternal Harvest Ministry established what they called their New Jerusalem in 1954. Founded by a charismatic preacher named Reverend Tobias Kane, this cult combined apocalyptic Christianity with agricultural mysticism to create a belief system that viewed human beings as crops to be cultivated for divine harvest. Kane preached that the end times were not a distant future event, but an ongoing process that required active participation from the faithful. His followers believed that through proper spiritual cultivation, they could transform themselves into perfect beings ready for harvest by angelic forces. This cultivation process involved extreme dietary restrictions, ritualistic agricultural work, and submission to what Kane called divine grafting procedures. The ministry's compound was designed as a working farm, but one where human beings were treated as the primary crop. Members were assigned specific roles based on their spiritual development, with new recruits serving as seedlings who required constant tending and monitoring. More advanced members became cultivators, responsible for nurturing the spiritual growth of others, while Cain's inner circle served as harvesters who determined when individuals were ready for the final transformation. The divine grafting procedures were perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the ministry's practices. Cain claimed to have received visions showing how human beings could be improved through surgical modifications that would prepare them for angelic existence. These procedures, performed in a makeshift medical facility within the compound, involved the removal of what Cain termed unnecessary organs and the implantation of materials that would supposedly enhance spiritual receptivity. Members who underwent grafting procedures often suffered severe complications, including infections, organ failure, and psychological breakdown. Those who survived displayed unusual scars and modifications that served as visible signs of their spiritual advancement within the ministry's hierarchy. Cain maintained detailed records of each procedure, describing them as necessary steps in humanity's evolution toward divine perfection. The ministry's recruitment methods were particularly effective among rural communities devastated by economic hardship. Cain presented his message as one of hope and transformation, promising that faithful members would inherit a perfect world free from poverty, disease, and suffering. Many families joined the ministry during the economic difficulties of the 1950s, seeking both spiritual solace and practical support for their basic needs. Life within the compound followed strict agricultural rhythms, with members rising before dawn to tend both traditional crops and their own spiritual development. Days were structured around group meditation, manual labor, and study of Cain's increasingly elaborate theological writings. Members were forbidden from leaving the compound without permission, and those who attempted to escape were subjected to intensive spiritual rehabilitation designed to root out their desire for worldly attachments. The ministry's practices first attracted outside attention in 1958 when a former member who had escaped during a medical emergency reported the cult's activities to federal authorities. Her testimony described a community where human experimentation was disguised as religious practice, and where members lived in constant fear of being selected for the next harvest ceremony. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of the ministry's horrors. Federal agents discovered a compound where over 300 individuals lived in conditions of systematic abuse and medical exploitation. The makeshift medical facility contained evidence of dozens of unauthorized surgeries, while mass graves on the property held the remains of those who had not survived their spiritual transformation. Cain's private quarters contained an extensive library of medical texts, surgical instruments, and detailed plans for expanding his human cultivation experiments. His journals revealed a man who had become convinced that he was a divine agent tasked with preparing humanity for a cosmic harvest that would separate the spiritually pure from the unworthy masses. The Reverend's final fate remains a mystery. When federal agents raided the compound, they found evidence that Cain had performed a final grafting procedure on himself, attempting to achieve the ultimate spiritual transformation. His body was never recovered, leading some investigators to believe he had fled into the wilderness, while others suspected he had died during his self-imposed surgery and been disposed of by his remaining followers. 6. The Celestial Order of Raven's Roost. High on the windswept peaks of Raven's Roost in North Carolina, where ancient Cherokee legends spoke of spirits that dwelt among the clouds, the Celestial Order established their mountain kingdom in 1949, led by a former astronomy professor named Dr. Helena Starweaver. This cult combined astronomical observation with ritualistic murder to create what they believed was a direct communication channel with extraterrestrial beings. Starweaver taught that Earth was under constant observation by advanced beings from distant star systems, and that these cosmic entities were preparing to select worthy humans for transportation to a higher plane of existence. Just, her followers, mostly educated individuals fascinated by the emerging science fiction culture of the era, believed that proper astronomical alignment combined with ritual sacrifice would attract the attention of these celestial observers. The Order's compound was built around a sophisticated observatory that Starweaver had constructed using funds from her wealthy followers. The facility included multiple telescopes, astronomical calculation equipment, and detailed star charts that supposedly revealed the optimal times for contacting the cosmic entities. Members spent their nights observing the heavens and their days preparing for the ritualistic ceremonies that would demonstrate their worthiness for celestial selection. Starweaver's doctrine required members to abandon all earthly attachments and prepare themselves for what she called the Great Translation. This preparation involved extensive study of astronomical phenomena, participation in group rituals designed to attune their consciousness to cosmic frequencies, and the gradual elimination of those deemed unworthy of celestial attention. The Order's rituals were timed to coincide with specific astronomical events, including eclipses, planetary alignments, and meteor showers. During these ceremonies, members would gather at carefully constructed stone circles positioned according to Starweaver's calculations, where they would perform elaborate rituals involving the sacrifice of individuals selected through a complex astrological process. New members underwent an initiation process called the Stellar Awakening, during which they were subjected to prolonged exposure to starlight while consuming psychoactive substances that Starweaver claimed would enhance their cosmic sensitivity. Many initiates experienced vivid hallucinations that they interpreted as direct communication with the celestial beings, reinforcing their belief in the Order's teachings. The compound's living conditions reflected Starweaver's belief that comfort and material possessions interfered with cosmic communication. Members lived in sparse dormitories, ate minimal rations designed to purify their bodies, and spent most of their time in meditation or astronomical observation. Those who showed signs of doubt or attempted to leave were subjected to intensive re-education sessions that often involved psychological torture disguised as spiritual counseling. The Order's activities remained hidden from outside scrutiny for nearly a decade, protected by their remote location and the reluctance of law enforcement to investigate what appeared to be a harmless group of astronomy enthusiasts. This changed in 1959 when a forest fire forced the evacuation of the area and revealed evidence of the Order's true activities. Firefighters and emergency workers who reached the compound discovered multiple burial sites containing the remains of individuals who had clearly been murdered in ritualistic fashion. The observatory itself contained detailed records of dozens of sacrificial ceremonies, along with astronomical charts marking the optimal times for future rituals. Starweaver's private study revealed the extent of her delusions and the calculated nature of her crimes. Her journals described elaborate theories about cosmic selection processes and detailed plans for expanding the Order's influence to attract more subjects for sacrifice. Most disturbing were her meticulous records of each victim's astrological profile and the supposed cosmic significance of their death. The investigation that followed uncovered evidence of at least 80 murders spanning the Order's 10-year existence. Victims included both cult members who had fallen out of favor and outsiders who had been lured to the compound under various pretenses. Many had been killed during elaborate ceremonies designed to coincide with specific astronomical events, their deaths timed according to Starweaver's twisted interpretation of celestial mechanics. When authorities finally moved to arrest the remaining Order members, they found the compound largely abandoned. Starweaver and her core followers had apparently fled into the mountains, leaving behind only their astronomical equipment and detailed records of their crimes. Local search teams spent months combing the wilderness, but no trace of the fugitives was ever found. The legacy of these mountain cults extends far beyond their individual crimes. Each group exploited the isolation and independence that characterized Appalachian life, using legitimate desires for spiritual meaning and community belonging as weapons against their victims. They transformed sacred beliefs into tools of manipulation, turning faith itself into a mechanism for unspeakable evil. But perhaps most disturbing is how easily these groups were able to operate without detection for years or even decades. The same geographical isolation that protected moonshine operations and family feuds also provided perfect cover for religious extremists who viewed other human beings as expendable resources in their twisted spiritual economies. What makes these stories even more chilling is how they reveal the dark underbelly of American religious freedom. While our Constitution protects the right to worship as we choose, it also created blind spots where charismatic leaders could exploit isolation and desperation to build their kingdoms of horror. The very values that made America great also made it possible for these predators to flourish in the shadows. 7. The Sacred Wound Society of Mourning Dove Hollow. In the deepest recesses of Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, where morning fog never quite lifts and the silence feels heavy enough to crush your chest, the Sacred Wound Society established their compound in 1962. Founded by a former military medic named Brother Matthias Crane, this cult developed an obsession with human suffering that transformed pain itself into their primary sacrament. Crane preached that Christ's crucifixion was not a singular historical event, but an ongoing process that required faithful participation from true believers. His followers believed that by inflicting and enduring specific types of wounds, they could share in divine suffering and achieve a state of spiritual ecstasy unavailable to ordinary Christians. The Society's doctrine centered around what they called the perpetual passion, a continuous reenactment of crucifixion that never allowed wounds to fully heal. The compound itself was designed as a massive torture chamber disguised as a religious retreat. Buildings were constructed with special rooms containing elaborate devices for inflicting controlled injuries, while medical facilities ensured that victims survived long enough to endure multiple sessions. Crane used his medical training to calculate precisely how much damage the human body could sustain while remaining conscious and aware. New members underwent an initiation called the first wounding, during which they received stigmata-like injuries on their hands and feet. These wounds were kept open through daily ritual cleansing with salt water and exposure to mountain air, creating a constant source of pain that members learned to interpret as divine communion. Those who complained or sought medical attention were accused of spiritual weakness and subjected to additional wounds as punishment. The society's hierarchy was determined by the severity and number of wounds each member carried. Those with the most extensive scarring held positions of authority, while newcomers were required to prove their devotion through increasingly extreme acts of self-mutilation. Crane maintained detailed medical records of each member's injuries, documenting their healing patterns and psychological responses to different types of trauma. Children born into the society were subjected to wounding rituals from infancy, with small cuts and burns administered as part of what Crane called sacred baptism. Many of these children never learned to interpret physical sensation normally, displaying unusual pain tolerance and disturbing behavioral patterns that concerned the few outsiders who observed them. The society's practices extended beyond self-inflicted wounds to include the systematic torture of those deemed spiritually inferior. Crane taught that causing suffering in others was a form of divine service, allowing the faithful to participate in God's judgment of the unworthy. These victims were often kept alive for weeks or months, their wounds carefully maintained to maximize their educational value for society members. Local authorities first became aware of the society in 1967 when a hiker discovered what appeared to be a crucifixion site in the mountains near their compound. The scene included wooden crosses, blood-stained ground, and evidence of recent use, though no bodies were found. Initial investigations were hampered by the society's isolation and their practice of disposing of bodies in the region's numerous caves and sinkholes. The truth about the Sacred Wound Society emerged gradually through the testimony of several members who managed to escape during the harsh winter of 1969. These survivors, many bearing extensive scars and displaying signs of severe psychological trauma, described a community where torture was not only accepted, but celebrated as the highest form of worship. Federal investigators who finally raided the compound found evidence of systematic abuse spanning nearly a decade. The medical facilities contained detailed records of hundreds of wounding procedures, while the compound's basement revealed holding cells where victims had been kept during extended torture sessions. Most disturbing were Crane's private journals, which described his experiments in human pain tolerance with the clinical detachment of a research scientist. 8. The Doomsday Chorus of Whisper Mountain. In the remote highlands of Tennessee, where winter winds create an almost constant moaning sound through the mountain passes, the Doomsday Chorus established their final sanctuary in 1971. Led by a former opera singer named Madame Evangeline Thorne, this cult believed that the world would end not with fire or flood, but with a cosmic song that would shatter reality itself. Thorne's doctrine taught that music was the fundamental force that held the universe together, and that by achieving perfect harmonic resonance, her followers could either prevent or accelerate the apocalypse. The chorus spent their days in constant vocal practice, attempting to discover the precise combination of notes that would grant them control over existence itself. Their compound echoed day and night with strange harmonies that seemed to carry for miles through the mountain valleys. The group's recruitment methods targeted musicians and vocally gifted individuals who were struggling with personal or professional difficulties. Thorn promised that membership in the chorus would unlock supernatural musical abilities and grant immortality through harmonic transcendence. Many talented performers abandoned successful careers to join what they believed was humanity's last hope for survival. Life within the compound revolved entirely around musical practice and performance. Members were awakened each morning by a complex choral arrangement that Thorn claimed would prepare their souls for the day's harmonic work. Meals were consumed in silence to preserve vocal quality, and conversation was limited to discussions of musical theory and apocalyptic prophecy. The chorus's practices became increasingly extreme as Thorn's visions grew more elaborate. She claimed to receive direct communication from cosmic entities through musical revelation, and her compositions became longer and more complex. Members were required to perform these pieces for hours at a time, often until they collapsed from exhaustion or suffered vocal damage from the strain. Those who failed to meet Thorn's musical standards were subjected to intensive retraining that bordered on torture. Singers were forced to hold impossible notes until they lost consciousness, while those who questioned the doctrine were made to perform solo arrangements designed to damage their vocal cords permanently. Many members developed severe throat problems and lost their ability to speak normally, communicating only through whispered fragments of Thorn's compositions. The chorus's most disturbing practice was their treatment of children who were viewed as possessing pure voices uncorrupted by worldly influence. Young members were subjected to intensive vocal training that often resulted in permanent damage to their developing vocal cords. Many were kept in isolation chambers where they practiced alone for days, emerging psychologically shattered and unable to relate to others except through song. Thorn's ultimate goal was the performance of what she called the Final Symphony, a composition that would supposedly bring about the end of the world while granting the chorus members eternal life in a realm of pure music. As this performance approached, the intensity of practice sessions increased dramatically, with members collapsing regularly from the physical and emotional strain. The chorus's activities came to an abrupt end in 1974 when local residents reported hearing screaming mixed with singing coming from Whisper Mountain. When authorities investigated, they found the compound filled with the bodies of chorus members who had apparently died during an attempted performance of the Final Symphony. Autopsies revealed that many had suffered massive vocal cord hemorrhaging, while others showed signs of psychological shock so severe that their hearts had simply stopped beating. Thorn herself was found in the compound's main performance hall, seated at a massive pipe organ with her hands still positioned on the keys. Her body showed no signs of physical trauma, but her face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Her final composition, written in blood on the organ's music stand, contained notation so complex that music theorists claimed it was impossible for human voices to perform. 9. The Flesh Gardeners of Thorn Valley. Hidden in a valley so remote that it appears on no official maps, the community known as the Flesh Gardeners emerged in 1976 under the leadership of a former medical researcher named Dr. Solomon Blackthorne. This cult developed an obsession with human anatomy that transformed surgery into a form of worship and the human body into a canvas for their twisted artistic vision. Blackthorne preached that the human form was fundamentally flawed and required extensive modification to achieve spiritual perfection. His followers believed that through carefully planned surgical procedures, they could transform themselves into beings more suited for divine communion. The community's compound included sophisticated medical facilities where members underwent increasingly extreme body modifications disguised as religious sacraments. The flesh gardening process began with minor procedures designed to test a member's commitment and pain tolerance. These initial modifications included scarification, ritual piercings, and the removal of supposedly unnecessary body parts like earlobes and fingertips. Those who endured these procedures successfully were considered ready for more advanced transformations. Advanced flesh gardening involved major surgical modifications that permanently altered members' appearance and functionality. Some underwent procedures to split their tongues or reshape their facial features, while others had organs relocated or modified to create what Blackthorne called improved spiritual architecture. Many of these procedures were performed without proper anesthesia, as pain was considered an essential component of the transformation process. The community's children were subjected to gradual modification from birth, with small procedures performed at regular intervals as they grew. By adulthood, many bore little resemblance to normal human beings, displaying a variety of surgical scars, modified features, and unusual body proportions. These individuals often struggled to integrate with the outside world, having been raised to view their modifications as marks of spiritual superiority. Blackthorne maintained detailed records of each procedure, documenting not only the surgical techniques, but also the psychological effects of various modifications. His journals revealed a man obsessed with pushing the boundaries of human anatomy, treating his followers as test subjects in an ongoing experiment in biological transformation. The community's practices extended beyond self-modification to include the systematic alteration of outsiders who were kidnapped and brought to the compound for experimental procedures. These victims were subjected to increasingly extreme modifications designed to test the limits of human survival and adaptation. Many died during these procedures, while survivors were often left permanently disabled and psychologically traumatized. The flesh gardener's activities remained hidden for nearly a decade, protected by their remote location and the reluctance of survivors to report experiences that seemed too bizarre to believe. This changed in 1985 when a forest fire forced the evacuation of several mountain communities and revealed evidence of the cult's medical facility. Emergency workers who reached the compound discovered a sophisticated surgical complex containing evidence of hundreds of unauthorized procedures. The facility included operating rooms, recovery areas, and holding cells where victims had been kept during their transformation process. Most disturbing were the detailed photographic records that documented each stage of the modification process. Federal investigators found evidence that Blackthorne had been conducting his experiments for nearly 2 decades, using the cult as cover for research that violated every principle of medical ethics. His private laboratory contained preserved specimens, surgical instruments, and detailed plans for expanding his work to include genetic modification and organ transplantation. When authorities moved to arrest the remaining community members, they found individuals so extensively modified that identification proved nearly impossible. Many displayed surgical alterations so extreme that they required immediate medical attention, while others had been so psychologically conditioned that they begged to be allowed to continue their transformation process. The mountains of Appalachia have always harbored secrets, but these cults represent something far more sinister than moonshine operations or family feuds. They reveal how isolation and desperation can be weaponized by charismatic leaders who view other human beings as raw material for their twisted visions. Each group exploited legitimate human needs for belonging, meaning, and spiritual connection, transforming these desires into tools for unspeakable abuse. What makes these stories particularly disturbing is how long these groups were able to operate without detection. The same geographical barriers that protected mountain communities from outside interference also created perfect conditions for predators to establish their kingdoms of horror. Federal law enforcement, state authorities, and local communities all failed to recognize the warning signs until it was too late for countless victims. But perhaps most chilling is the realization that these documented cases represent only a fraction of what may have occurred in Appalachia's most remote valleys. How many other cults operated and disappeared without leaving any trace? How many victims were buried in unmarked graves or disposed of in the region's countless caves and sinkholes? The mountains keep their secrets well, and some mysteries may never be fully uncovered. As we prepare to explore the final chapter of this dark history, remember that these were real people who suffered and died in ways that challenge our understanding of human cruelty. Their stories deserve to be told, not for entertainment, but as a warning about what can happen when society looks the other way and allows evil to flourish in the shadows. The most terrifying aspect of these Appalachian cults isn't their individual crimes, but how they reveal the fragility of civilization itself. In valleys where federal authority was nothing more than a distant rumor, charismatic predators transformed legitimate spiritual yearning into instruments of unspeakable horror. They exploited the very isolation that made mountain life appealing, turning remote hollows into kingdoms where normal moral boundaries simply ceased to exist. What haunts investigators who studied these cases isn't just the brutality they uncovered, but the systematic nature of the abuse. These weren't crimes of passion or moments of madness. They were carefully orchestrated campaigns of terror that operated for years, sometimes decades, protected by geography and the reluctance of authorities to venture into regions where their jurisdiction meant nothing. The survivors who emerged from these groups carried scars that went far beyond physical damage. Many struggled for years to readjust to normal society, having been conditioned to view pain, submission, and unquestioning obedience as virtues. Some never fully recovered, spending their remaining years in institutions or isolated communities where they could hide their trauma from a world that struggled to comprehend what they had endured. Perhaps most disturbing is how these cults exploited America's greatest strength, religious freedom, as a shield for their activities. By wrapping their crimes in theological language and claiming divine mandate for their actions, they created a protective barrier that made investigation difficult and prosecution even harder. Local authorities often hesitated to intervene in what appeared to be religious communities, while federal agents struggled with jurisdictional limitations and constitutional concerns. The documentation that survives from these groups reveals a common pattern of escalation. What began as seemingly harmless religious communities gradually transformed into totalitarian systems where leaders wielded absolute power over every aspect of their followers' lives. The progression was often so gradual that members didn't recognize their situation until escape became impossible. Modern cult experts who have studied these historical cases identify several warning signs that appeared consistently across different groups: isolation from family and friends, surrender of personal possessions, punishment for questioning authority, and the gradual normalization of increasingly extreme behaviors all served as stepping stones toward total control. By the time victims recognized the danger, they were often too psychologically damaged or physically weakened to resist. The legacy of these mountain cults extends into contemporary discussions about religious extremism and the limits of government intervention. Law enforcement agencies have developed new protocols for investigating isolated religious communities, while mental health professionals have gained valuable insights into the long-term effects of cult membership on survivors and their families. But questions remain about what might still be hidden in Appalachia's most remote valleys. The region's vast wilderness areas, countless abandoned mining operations, and traditional suspicion of government authority continue to provide potential refuge for those who would exploit others under the guise of religious devotion. Recent reports of unusual activity in certain mountain areas suggest that the dark legacy of these historical cults may not be entirely consigned to the past. As we conclude this journey into Appalachian darkness, it's important to remember that these stories serve as more than historical curiosities. They remind us that evil can flourish anywhere that good people choose to look the other way, and that the price of freedom includes eternal vigilance against those who would abuse it. The mountains may keep their secrets, but the lessons of these forgotten tragedies must not be lost to time. The next time you find yourself in the shadow of those ancient peaks, listening to the wind move through valleys that have witnessed centuries of human tragedy, remember that some hollows echo with more than just natural sounds. They carry the voices of those who disappeared into darkness, calling out across the years as a warning to anyone willing to listen. What do you think about these buried chapters of American history? Have you ever encountered strange communities or unusual religious groups in remote areas? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know if you've had your own unsettling experiences in the mountains. If this exploration of hidden history left you looking over your shoulder, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Our next investigation takes us even deeper into America's forgotten darkness, exploring abandoned government facilities where experiments were conducted that make these cult activities seem almost tame by comparison. Trust me, what we've uncovered in those classified files will change how you view your own government forever. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones hiding in the woods. They're the ones who convince others to follow them into the darkness willingly.